My name is Gavin Manger, and I'm the Strategic Engagement Manager for Landor LINKS. There are a lot of names I do recognise out there, but for those that don't know me, I've been involved in parking and transportation for coming up 35, 36 years now. I'm working for some of the big sort of private operators and some of the local authorities throughout that year. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. If possible, if you have any questions, could you put them in the Q&A box, not the chat? And I will endeavour to try and get through them at the end. Question and answers will be at the end of all the presentations. As I said, I will try and get through as many as possible, although we have a lot of people online and we have some very interesting presentations today. Thank you. Just before we start, I'm going to have a very shameless plug for the Decarbonisation and Transport Awards run by Landor LINKS. Entries are now open and will close on the 5th of December. And the award ceremony is actually on the 27th of March at the Royal Lancaster Hotel in London. So please do enter. You can do that by entering the web address at the bottom of the page. And I will remind you of that again at the end, I'm afraid. So a couple of shameless plugs this morning. But first of all, we have 4 speakers today. We have Pete Dyson, behavioural scientist from the University of Bath, Gossica Anichebe from London Borough of Hackney, Adam Bunce, the Managing Director of Ethos, and Nicola Lodge from ITP. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I first started, parking was very much a matter of putting some TROs out, putting some bodies out on the street and issuing as many PCNs as possible. Now, I know some of you will say that wasn't true, perhaps in your boroughs, but certainly, perhaps a bit of a generalisation, but certainly very true for some of the people I worked with. It's interesting to see now that there are people involved that are looking at the behavioural way we're doing it, and perhaps better ways of not just issuing loads of PCNs and encouraging people to get out of their cars and to think more about where they're parking and where they're going. So I'm very interested about what's going to be said today. So without further ado, Pete, perhaps I can hand over to you and we will come back at the end for Q&As of everybody else. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that introduction. It's great to be with you all. I think I'm now sharing my screen. Could I get a thumbs up if that's going all right?
All good, Pete.
Thank you. Yeah, good to hear from the introduction there, and I think you set up that nicely. I hope as the first speaker try and set a little bit of the tone as well. So what I'm going to share is a broader review of the role of parking, some contemporary issues and technologies and regulations that are coming out, recommendations that the Transport Planning Society had made, which I think are a good overall range of policies out there. And finally, some pieces on policy acceptability or public response to changes in parking in their area, which would be more my area of psychology and behavioural science and public engagement. So to warm us up, to begin with, I thought of just a short collage to refresh and recap our minds about the many different types of parking that there are out there. In the UK, there are about 35 million vehicles. Think about 75% of them live in home parking, and 25% of them live on street parking. And you get this whole range of driveway parking, informal street parking, and formal street parking. We'll see in the second row there everything from a multi-story car park to a pay and display to workplace charging, and as we'll get to EV charging that's often accompanying it, to destination charging, to parking as a way of accessing public transport. Shown there is a park and ride in Norwich, and unusually long stay parking where vehicles are stored either when people are on holiday or away. The provocation and the important question here, I think, is to what extent is parking a cost or a revenue generator, or both? So while we typically think of people paying for parking, it's the end user, the car driver, demand management is issued, and they pay in different ways. Housing developers and homeowners effectively are paying for parking through the choices they make about the housing developments that are there. Homeowners, some might value a home with a parking space more than others. And in land use, local authorities, government, private sector are making choices about using land for parking rather than for other purposes. And businesses will often, and site owners will assume that in order to have a functioning business, they need to have parking in order to service their needs. So there's a really broad point I wanted to get us thinking about the way in which the purchaser of parking is to some extent the end user, seems to be the car driver, but there are also all these other costs or opportunity costs of ways land could be used for different purposes. And in a way, non-car drivers or people not using parking are also paying that opportunity cost because land could have been used for other things. But as I say, there are 35 million vehicles out there at any given time. 96% of them are parked. So 96% of the time, a vehicle is stationary. And these interesting statistics from University of Leeds and Decarbonate study finds that sometimes up to, I would stress up to 74% of traffic volume can be caused looking for parking. So the ability of people to find a parking space is an important source of vehicle mileage, and in particular that final mile congestion you can just see in urban areas. We see the ways in which using car clubs and parking in harmony can lead to a car club replacing the need for private vehicle ownership and private vehicle storage in a way. And the different purposes of parking can be connected to repurposing a vehicle parking space for some cycle parking can generate significant retail spend, even if on the face of it, it seems people access sites through car, given the choice and opportunity. Sometimes it can really help grow the area. So a short review of literature there, of which the second on that list, Donald Shoup, was someone I wanted to highlight, not least because he is exceptional, as I think, as a man that dedicated the whole of his professional life studying parking, and he passed away in February. He was an academic at UCLA in the US, and is well known for this book, The High Cost of Free Parking. You'll see there him pictured outside a university building, I think. And he's known for the way in which he described and showed that low-cost parking has social and economic costs, and contrarily, increasing and changing parking minimums, parking tariffs can lead to net socially beneficial outcomes. And I believe, and happy to be corrected, he's known for demonstrating the rule of thumb of 85% occupancy, which is to say, when you're scaling back the amount of parking, there needs to be a slight oversupply in order to diminish that problem of people searching for a long time for a parking space and that generating a lot of traffic. So you can already see there's this tension between supply and demand here. To set some context as well, and I think this hopefully just sets up other speakers. This is a review of the broad big movements in parking strategy and regulation and technology, at least in the UK. I hope that we might hear a bit more about the role of parking in a wider, at least in an urban sense, a curbside strategy, with Lambeth Council well known for its curbside strategy, looking at the many different uses that the curb can have, from deliveries to pedestrian access to utilities access as public space. So you can't really answer the parking question without talking about the other options of its land use. The bottom left there, you see, we might hear more mention about pavement parking, a consultation that the DFT did in 2020 with a long-awaited sort of response and initiative with a balance between what central government will describe for what local areas would do, the extent to which central government might lead the way on a policy that is already in action in London and in Edinburgh, but whose land uses have already adapted. And there'd be a longer talk about parking minimums and maximums, I'm sure, and their impact on land use and housing developments. Very contemporary for this year and next is the new national parking platform, which changes the way in which people will access parking from a range of different apps to consolidation into one area. That now moving to a private supplier for the management of those different services. I thought it was worthy of mention that the workplace parking levy is another mechanism in place. I suspect we're generally all familiar, but having been introduced in Nottingham something like 10 or 15 years ago, where workplaces are charged, or workplaces with more than 10 car parking spaces, I believe, are then charged by the council. They can either take that cost on themselves or pass it on to their employees, and the revenues generated part fund public transport. To the best of my knowledge, and this is where I wanted to invite anyone in the Q&A or the chat, to my knowledge, it's in action in Nottingham. It's proposed in Bristol, Leeds and Oxford, but it would be interesting to know what other places also have workplace parking levies on their policy agenda, in the different documents and different forms that might take. And very finally, on a sort of broader view of things, would be road user charging. And it's been said, and I think this is a nice quip, that parking is effectively already road user charging, but for when the vehicle is stationary. Because in parking sense, we do it by different time, different places, have different charges. So in that sense, when that metaphor was shared with me, I really thought that there's a gap in people's minds to think that they are already charged in different ways for the use of their vehicle. As I say, peak time, different parking places, different spots. So those two things strike me as being connected in some way. It would be difficult to have an entire road user charging comprehensive view without also addressing parking within that. I want to talk through the Transport Planning Society's review, which I think was last year, which talk about different policies. Probably don't have time to go through all, I think 18 or 19 of them, but we'll go through some of them, and I think the document broadly prioritizes them. So for the first one, talking about having maximum car parking standards for new developments, which I think the UK brought in around 2005 or 2008, and go into many effects there. On-street controls to limit overspill of parking, using parking supply as a bridge to transition car use from different targets, allowing sufficient parking for supermarkets to become viable. I'm on number 4 now, and I'm aware we probably wouldn't go through all 18 of them, but I do recommend the document. It gives both a good review of parking policy principles in the UK, and then sections them into ways of doing vehicle control, and then talking about the wider potential land uses for parking. And it really goes to show, if nothing else, there's a huge range of levers at people's disposal in a private setting with different technologies coming on board, and with a local government setting with a different balance and different mix of things that can be used to shape behaviour. I wanted to finish by concentrating on areas of public acceptability and people's response to parking. And this very recent paper in a journal published this year offers an interesting and useful model. And by model, I mean these 3 factors that broadly are a framework for understanding people's responses to parking policies. So First would be their own, you'll see travel and built environment factors. So their own built environment and the way in which they travel, irrespective of anything about them, their travel behaviour will impact upon their preferences for different parking policies. Then secondly, psychological factors of how they understand the nature of a parking problem and what they think are different solutions. So the extent to which they think a policy seems fair or unfair, the extent to which they think that vehicles are a large source of emissions or have a large or small impact on the urban environment. So their understanding or their conception of what they think are the impacts of this bundle of sort of psychological factors. And then the socio-demographic factors that would predict a little bit like your own travel practices. Would expect someone who's more reliant on their vehicle to have different preferences for parking to non-vehicle owners. Now, this study interestingly finds that between push and pull measures, converting on-street parking into alternative land uses can receive high levels of support from residents. And indeed, that acceptability can be highest in those densely populated and mixed-use areas, with the authors proposing that these are areas already where the public are aware that there's parking needs to be and will always be scarce, and its management needs to be carefully managed. Secondly, a study from 5 years ago, I think, shed a good light on the similarities and differences between different groups of their different groups' perspectives on parking acceptability over time and in different situations. So you'll see here on the right-hand side a set of lines. Each line describes a different group, be it a 0-car household, a 1 or 2-car household, whether they have bicycle ownership, and then whether they are classified in those dotted green lines on their phase of where their mind is at on car use. So pre-decisional would be someone who's not looking to change their car ownership status. Number 10, pre-actional and actional, is someone who's taking steps. And number 11 is someone who has reduced their level of car ownership. And I stress those ones because you'll see there are the biggest differences in lines there. That someone who has no consideration or no change in car ownership typically has a lower level of support for these different measures shown on screen, with the first most negative spread being the extension of parking fees and more parking restrictions, all the way to obviously greater public support, more unanimity around improving public transport supply. I was struck in this graph by the way in which there are differences between people, but they're broadly not as different as we probably might expect. And the authors of this study note that while residents support financial policies the least, they're more receptive towards parking policies than policymakers assume. And in this study, they also interviewed a set of planners and policymakers. And the important thing is if the reuse of parking spaces creates space for other users and can be shown to increase quality of life in other ways, for instance, by adding bike lanes, expanding sidewalks, creating greenery, and so on and so forth. And that comes to the sort of nub of it all, which is people don't want to see or don't consider policies fair when they merely take something away. They want to see and have described the benefits of what they of what actions come out of them, even if they don't necessarily benefit that person as an individual. And that leads me to finish on a discussion point about carrot and stick. And I think this comes up quite a lot in sustainable travel behaviour change. I wrote an article a year or two ago about that metaphor called Beyond Carrots and Sticks. So I come to this with already an axe to grind, so to speak. But it's it's a metaphor for push and pull measures, but in itself, it's not particularly helpful, certainly not to publish parking changes as being stick measures, when in fact it does rather describe who's getting a carrot and who's getting a stick. So if we cast our minds to the previous slide, a stick for drivers might be a carrot for people walking, cycling, pedestrian access. So always thinking in terms of things when they are both things, but for different people, it's helpful just to elevate the nature of the lever, not merely as presenting it as sticks, as punishments, but of saying, here are the benefits and here are the ways in which it can help people. But a slightly more conceptual point to end on, I know, but happy to take more in the Q&A. I'll finish there and hand over back to Gavin. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete. Really interesting. Really appreciate that. And there's certainly some questions coming in the box, which we'll grab at the end. It's really interesting for me, and I know that there are some people out there that will say, no, we had this, but I remember that there weren't car clubs. There was very little cycle parking, certainly no parklets or hubs. And, hubs is a word that has only sort of come on my radar in the last couple of years. National Parking Platform is an interesting one. There weren't parking apps. You paid in a meter and had to have coins with you, and the congestion charge and clean air zones and 20-mile-an-hour zones and things like that. It's really interesting when you list it out, the sort of changes that we've now got to take into consideration when looking at parking strategies and curbside management. So thank you. Certainly given me food for thought, and lots of people are putting questions in the chat. So thank you, Pete. We're now going to come on to an award winner, Rising Star Award at the last Parking Awards back a couple of months ago. Gossica Anichebe, who's the Policy and Projects Manager, Parking Markets and Street Trading for the London Borough of Hackney. And I think she might answer, I've seen some of her slides, I think she might answer some of the questions posed by Pete there. So Gossica, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you, Gavin, for that introduction. I'll just present my screen. Please, can you confirm that you can see this?
Yeah, we can see that now, Gossica.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So my name is Gossica Anichebe. Thank you, Gavin, again for that introduction. And today I'm going to talk to you about from cars to clean air and how to use parking policy as a sustainable lever. So at Hackney, what did we do? We have a parking enforcement plan, and as part of our engagement process, we wanted to raise awareness for the parking enforcement plan that we was going to go out and consult on. And it was really important to gather input from from everybody to build in support, to educate residents, and also to engage a wide range of people. So that was what was really important as part of our parking enforcement plan. We had over 8,000 responses to the PEP, which is quite a lot. The PEP before that had about 1,200. So we received a lot of people coming back to us and saying what they thought about our PEP. And our main focus on the PEP was around sustainability on the last iteration. It's done every 5 years. Our campaign strategy was wide and diverse. So it was really important that we spoke to all members of our community. And we did that by doing lots of engagement sessions, by communicating via different platforms and making sure that we did translation for our posters and things like that. And as a result, our 3 drivers were innovative policy, community impact, and a proven CO2 emission reduction. And that's what I'm going to talk to you today. And at the centre of all of this was the Hackney Council's shared environmental sustainability goal, and they want to do something around pollution and air quality in the borough as a whole. And we understood the links between parking policy and CO2 and how we could work together as a team in Hackney over the different teams that we have, and also getting the community behind us, and how behavioural change in the borough could also change how we do things in the future. So what were our innovative policies? I think it's important for me to mention at this point as well is that I am a resident of Hackney. So for me, it was a personal journey as well as one as a project and policy manager, sorry. But one of the things we wanted to make sure we did was have a full parking zone coverage in the borough, and our operations team did just that in parking. They went out, they consulted, and by 2022, we had 100% coverage in our borough. But emissions-based charging was one of the key things that we put in our parking enforcement plan, and it was really important to have a balanced approach. We needed to understand the people, so it was important in order to get those changes in behaviour that we did it over a 7 and a 5 year period. It was 5 years for on street and 7 for estates. We had full disclosure of what the permit prices were going to be over that time, so we can get people to understand if they didn't change their behaviours, then this is what they would pay. And that was one of the levers that we used. But we also understood that within the place of Hackney, only 1/3 of residents drove, and it was a dense population. So you've got lots of flats, lots of HMOs, and that was a consideration as well that we looked at. So our emission-based charging, the long-term vision was this, that we wanted people in diesel to go into petrol, people in petrol to go into hybrid, those were in hybrid to go into electric. And then if you started in a petrol, then from petrol to hybrid, hybrid to electric, and then electric to public transport. And if you started in a hybrid car, then we wanted you to think about moving to electric and moving from electric to public transport or public transport to cycling. And what was important in this is that some people who could afford it, they could move straight from diesel to electric. But if you couldn't, in terms of the cost of the vehicle or not having the resources to do that, then it was that step change, and recognising that that step change was also a journey that anyone could go through. And as I mentioned myself, I started in a petrol vehicle, but through these changes, it made me rethink my journey and whether or not I needed to have a petrol vehicle, and I then invested into a hybrid. So that is what we wanted to do with the residents of Hackney and help them understand. And it really was helpful by having the prices and knowing how much you were going to pay upfront. It really did help with that decision making when you're on the forecourt and you're making that choice of whether or not you should have a vehicle of petrol, diesel or electric or hybrid, or whether or not you need to drive. So we wanted to include everyone. So we wanted people that had short stay parking that came into Hackney to rethink whether they need to drive. And we did this through 2 ways. We looked at the price, and we also looked at whether or not they needed to drive. And if you are a diesel vehicle, petrol vehicle, hybrid or electric, we do fuel-based charging for short stay parking to try and encourage people to pay. They'll pay more if they do not drive sustainably, and if they do not have an electric car or a hybrid car, then leave the car at home, travel by bus, travel by cycle, walk if you're able to. We also had a diesel surcharge. The diesel surcharge itself was designed to encourage people to have better choices, and we were one of the first London boroughs to introduce a diesel surcharge. We do have exemptions for RDE2 vehicles, which sometimes are cleaner than some of the most some petrol vehicles. So we do have an exemption for that because our diesel surcharge reaches hundreds of pounds. And we had really positive feedback from residents and press, and that was our why, because we wanted people to be healthier in the areas that they lived. And again, holding our visitor parking into account. So we held residents that had visitors that came to Hackney, we held them to account. And we did that by introducing annual limits for residents. And those limits, for every 20 books, so the first 1 to 20 books, you pay more if you go over those 20 books, and you pay a bit more, and it just continues up until your limit. And that by doing that, we saw a drop in how many people started to use visitor vouchers and bought them to give to their visitors. But we also had a 50% discount, which was really important for people with disabilities or people that were over 60. So we didn't want people who have disabilities to be adversely affected. So what is our hierarchy of needs? Just talking about people with disabilities, we put visitors and people that have come here parking as a visitor at the bottom, businesses and next, and third-party sector organisations, residents, ultra-low emission vehicles, car clubs and car sharing. But right at the top of that is blue badge holders and accessible parking. So all of our policies are designed with blue badge holders in mind. We think of them first. And I think this is a really important thing to any policymaker out there, that they're thinking about introducing parking charges, that you do need to think about those that need to drive and do not exclude them from being able to do that. And that's what we did here at Hackney. And we did that through a range of things. So we had introduced from people telling us that just having disabled bays outside of the home was not enough. So our parking operation team, they introduced personalised permit bays and personalised disabled bays. We also introduced a companion e-badge, which means that people that have disabilities do not need to display their blue badge in their vehicle. They use the companion e-badge because they're residents, and that it frees their blue badge to actually go around with them. So if they're in another car, they can then use that blue badge with that person that's driving them around to park. And we also have a community support permit for those that are delivering services to people within the borough. Up to now, we have over 200 personalised disabled bays that have been installed. So what was the community impact? Cycle hangers. We need to ensure that we were looking at saying to people, look, parking, we want you to think whether or not you do need to drive, but we also need people to think about, we need to think about how we can provide sustainable solutions. So we invested into a cycle hanger programme. And that cycle hanger programme had positive feedback, not just from the press, but also from residents. And as you can see at the bottom there, me too. It made it more easier when you live in a smaller apartment, or if you live in places where you cannot store a bike, it makes it easier to be able to own a bike and use your bike every day. And up to now, we had our 1000th cycle hanger. We did that earlier on this year. And we have an ambition to install 675 hangers by May 2026. And as you can see, we've only got 18 more to go. So what that means is that at the end of this current cycle, we would have installed 8,250 cycle hangers. At the moment, we've only got 108 more to go, and we're superseding our targets 7 months early. So talking about solutions, partnership is really important. We've got a fabulous street scene department that helps us deliver things like electric vehicle charging points. So we have aspiration to get electric vehicle charging points in the borough, 2,500 of them. And we're doing that at the moment. And they've also done electric vehicle car clubs. So there's a number of them in Hackney that we're doing at the moment to ensure that we're also thinking about how we can expand the electric vehicle charging point, not just to our residents, but also to initiatives such as car sharing and car clubs. And protecting our schools is really important. So up to now, we have 49 different school streets. And this again is working with our street scene counterparts in Hackney to do this. And we also have a last mile permit. And this last mile permit is where delivery companies deliver to a location where they can offload into sustainable options to do that last mile of the delivery by foot. And it takes away can take away up to 6 vans from the road. So this is something that Hackney is also doing. And then we've got low traffic neighbourhoods. So low traffic neighbourhoods, again, protecting residential streets when it comes to parking. So we have 81/82 now, I think, low traffic neighbourhoods in Hackney. And we understand that the majority of people that are coming into Hackney and getting PCNs are not local residents, they're people that are coming in and don't understand the rules. We have, again, thinking about blue badge holders, a HAC01 permit, which provides an exemption to blue badge holders. And we were the first in London to introduce a taxi card exemption developed with UNEX for blue badge holders, which means that if someone that's got a disability is in a cab, they can also go through the LTNs if they are registered. And we are hopefully planning to expand the HA01 permit to non-residents. That's something we're thinking of doing. And again, thinking about inclusive green travel, we don't leave people with disabilities behind. We put them at the top of our hierarchy of needs. So when it comes to electric vehicle charging, we are looking to do electric vehicle charging with disabled bays, and we've got funding to install that at the moment, working with our street scene counterparts. But what is our proven emission reduction, I hear you ask? Well, we said at the start of this that we would deliver a 15% reduction in diesel vehicles in Hackney by 2027, that we will also reduce the number of short stay parking by 30%, that we reduce the number of visitor voucher parking by 15%, and that we would also reduce the number of polluting vehicles in Hackney as well. And to date, we have done that. We reduced it by 16%, so over-delivered when it comes to diesel vehicle surcharge and the diesel vehicles in Hackney. Visitor vouchers, we achieved that earlier this year. It's now 31% less people buying visitor vouchers. When it comes to reducing the visitor vouchers, sorry, short stay parking, let me correct myself there, is 31%. Visitor vouchers is 15%, sorry about that. And then polluting vehicles has also reduced. So we are, at the moment, we're doing everything we can, and we're monitoring our impacts. It's really important. And the last one was reduced by 9% as of September this year. So what does that mean in terms of a decarbonisation impact and the result? So you can see here what our road transport was before. And now you can see that it has been reduced by this amount, 2,652 tonnes of CO2, which means, and that's per annum, that's a 2.2% reduction. And what that also means from a decarbonisation perspective is that for every 1 tonne of CO2 that comes to 500 cubic meters of hot air balloon. So that's what it looks like in terms of the reduction that we have done in Hackney. But in summary, what did we do? We ensured that we had innovative ideas, that we decreased most of our polluting vehicles. It was really important to do that. We encouraged sustainability over time by ensuring people what our pricing was going to be over a 5 and 7 year period. We held everyone accountable, including variable visitor voucher prices. We increased our cycle hanger storage and electric vehicle charging points. We wanted people to rethink whether they needed to drive by reducing traffic congestions and dependency on cars. And in terms of our community impact, we wanted to support people through that change. And what it leads me to then say is, what can you do? So within your organisation, what you can do is that you can embed sustainability into parking policy from the start. You can use resident experience to shape your policies. And I think it's really important that you link every decision back to fairness and long-term behavioural change. And that is the end. Thank you so much. I'll hand back to you, Gavin.
You got they're really interesting, and I do love the picture. Easier for me. Thank you. It's really interesting to sort of see that you take people on the journey. It goes back to Pete's carrot and stick, I guess. I'm certainly one of the people over the last couple of years that have changed my driving habits. Everyone who knows me in this industry knows that I have a big old Land Rover Defender that I love. I'm never going to sell it, but I have taken it off the road, and I'm now driving a very small, my children call it the skateboard, but I'm driving a very small, much less polluting car. So it's really interesting to sort of see what you're doing in Hackney and the provision of alternatives which will get people out of their cars and perhaps cycling, walking, etc., or certainly less journeys. Thank you very much for that. Questions are still coming in, so if I can just remind you, please put them in Q&A, not the chat. I can't monitor both of them at the end, but there's certainly a lot coming in at the Q&A, which we appreciate. So we'll now move on to Adam Bunce. Adam is the Managing Director of Ethos, and obviously Ethos is sponsoring today's webinar. So Adam, I don't know if you could turn your camera on, and I will leave you to it. Okay, we can't. I don't know if you'll speak. We can't hear you, and your
Right,
second slides are just coming. Right, there you go. Yeah, all good.
There we go.
Thank you, Adam.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Yeah, hello and good morning. Thank you to everyone for joining this morning. I hope you're finding it useful from some of the conversations that we're having around parking and sustainable transport. I wanted Ethos to sort of be front and centre of this webinar because it's something that we feel very passionate about. As Gavin mentioned, I'm Adam Bunce and I'm the Managing Director of Ethos, and we have substantial experience in delivering parking strategies and active travel projects, which has sort of enabled us to realise the positive integration that can exist between the two. As an organisation, we were established originally in 2012. Ethos wasn't our original name, it was 2020 Consultancy. But not only was 2020 not a particularly good year for obvious reasons, there's only so many times you can actually be doing presentations where someone interrupts you to tell you that you've got the incorrect date on your presentation before you realise actually it's probably better that we change our name. We work almost exclusively in the public sector. We work across the UK, and I'd probably estimate we work well over 150 public sector organisations now, from central government to combined authorities, all the different types of local councils, through to NHS trusts and many, many schools. The majority of our work falls into one of those three sort of areas that you can see on your screen, but they're all sort of very closely linked. I don't think you can deliver a parking project or an active travel project without thinking about road safety and vice versa. So it works very well, sort of focusing on those three areas. So why do we think it's a good idea to integrate active and sustainable travel into parking strategies? There's lots of reasons, to be honest, but it can reduce car park demand, and that can have really positive impacts on air quality in the environment. And it can also free up land if done correctly, and car parks especially are generally sort of in ideal locations and prime land development. And there seems to be sort of a reoccurring consideration across the UK with local authorities actually thinking about car park disposal strategies, predominantly probably due to budget pressures that so many of us are experiencing. Done correctly, the greater the investment in active travel and sustainable travel, the higher the likelihood of achieving modal shift. It can promote public transport and active travel at the same time. That being said, it's critical that the most appropriate projects are prioritised to enable that. And I'd probably say that almost needs its own webinar in itself due to the complexities and the thought considerations around that. But what I would say is there certainly isn't a one-boot-fits-all approach to this. Parking strategy should be closely aligned with future growth and development within the local area. Integrating active and sustainable transport into the strategy should positively contribute to urban development, creating more livable and environmentally friendly communities. I'm not sure if any of you have watched Paradise, which is a brilliant TV series. I think it's on Disney, but if you haven't, I'm not going to give anything away. However, what I would say is that if you could imagine an alternative reality where you could sort of start again with designing towns and cities, I expect most of us would make a lot of changes to how we would travel and move around. This would naturally have a major impact on parking. My personal view is I wouldn't let private vehicles sort of anywhere near town and city centres, maybe with the exception of those sort of that would need to, and blue badge holders would be a prime example of that. Instead, I would be looking at developing sort of high quality integrated transport hubs that you could locate on the edge of towns and city centres with high quality public transport and micro mobility options such as hire bikes that you could use for the last bit of the journey. Whilst this approach might seem like wishful thinking, in reality, it's actually surprising how achievable this model can be in most towns and cities. The infrastructure requirements might differ, but if I recall, most of our most recent sort of projects where we've been looking at parking strategies and sort of proposals, there has been scope for this as an approach to be taken forward. And I think we have put it forward for most, which seem to have been well received. The greatest barrier to achieving this is probably going to come from stakeholders because, let's face it, as a society, we don't like change. Behaviour change is clearly something that needs to be prioritised to really sort of drive home this approach. There's a growing number of positive and meaningful schemes being delivered across the UK. We've heard of some really good ones today, but not just in London now. And that's really sort of setting a strong foundation for achieving behaviour change. The curbside is a prime example of this. There's lots of competing priorities with the curbside, which is traditionally sort of kept almost exclusively for vehicle parking. But this doesn't have to be the case. And again, we've sort of seen that in some of the slides already. Cycle lanes, cycle parking, EV charging, car club bays, parklets and rain gardens are all great examples of alternative uses to the curbside. And if we can sort of shift that usual rhetoric that if we look to remove any sort of parking from the curbside, then we're looking at sort of capital punishment, then we can actually commence the necessary behaviour change process quite quickly. The most important part of this is stakeholder engagement, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So what are the benefits of prioritising the curbside? There'll be a reduction in emissions, and again, sort of improvements to air quality. There'll be improvements to public health, as this approach will encourage walking and cycling, and even public transport can encourage physical activity. Most of the alternatives to the curbside take up less space than what a vehicle will do, so we can optimise what is often sort of limited space in urban environments. Sometimes it's possible to combine sort of more than one sort of alternative to on-street parking due to those sort of space savings. I think we've all seen those sort of wonderful visualizations that sort of get sketched up, which show how these sort of environments can look. And let's face it, that probably sort of certainly makes me feel that I want to live there, because you feel that there is going to be that sort of overall quality of life improvements that could be made. I was going to sort of go into a bit of detail on Lambeth's curbside strategy that sort of promotes active and sustainable transport through a bold approach, which is looking to reallocate sort of 25% of their curbside space from car parking to alternatives. However, probably a lot of you now might have seen that strategy, but if you haven't, I would certainly recommend investing maybe sort of 30 minutes of your time to really sort of have a review of that, because it's a brilliant trailblazing approach to sort of realising this model in practice. I'm also aware that Haringey have recently sort of developed a curbside strategy, and I think that's out to consultation at the moment. So that'd be a great opportunity to sort of positively contribute to their strategy. So again, if you can, check out what they are proposing. So hopefully I've done a good job in justifying the benefits of this as a viable approach, but to bring about meaningful change, it takes a lot, and you're probably sort of sat there thinking it's great to have the ambition, but in reality, it's going to be a lot different and a lot more hard. This is very true. And like I said earlier, there isn't a one boot that fits all approach. The organisation needs to be ready to actually sort of stand a chance of achieving success. And by that, I mean there needs to be strong support and buy-in from both senior leadership and your local members. Whilst that can be challenging, it's certainly possible with a clear, viable engagement plan. As part of that engagement, it's vital there is a clear plan in place on how stakeholder resistance and concerns are addressed. Whilst it's not possible to adapt schemes to meet everyone's concerns, feedback cannot be ignored. Data is really useful to bust myths and address concerns, because quite often people have these sort of myths around issues and challenges that are going to exist, but actually it's not the reality. Members are often sort of led by the data as well, so collating accurate, up-to-date data that will support recommendations can be challenging, but if you can sort of bring it together, it can really sort of bring about that positive change. If data integration can be embedded into new projects, this can be really useful when monitoring the success. However, I do appreciate that sort of technological compatibility can be sort of quite troublesome for some local authorities due to sort of restrictions that sort of ICT and data protection can have. But if you can get that in place, then it can be really useful again to sort of build up that evidence and to support that sort of data-led approach. I'm a great believer in quick wins, regardless of how sort of big or small, because getting some actions from a strategy delivered as early as possible is a great way to actually gain support and buy-in early, because it demonstrates that this isn't going to be sort of a document that's going to sit around sort of not doing much for 5 to 10 years before being revisited. I've mentioned a couple of times the importance of stakeholder engagement. I firmly believe the more you put into engagement, the easier the outputs will be, even if it can still be challenging to resolve. At the heart of our engagement approach is a robust plan that we create at the start of each project, and this acts as our guide, including all stakeholder details and mapping, the most suitable approach to engage in each of the groups, how often to engage, and sort of the ongoing sentiment tracker that we have to sort of ensure that the positivity and buy-in is increasing throughout the project. We also sort of recommend a two-stage process to engagement wherever you possibly can. An early stage gives everyone a chance to have a say about what they like, what they don't like, and generally sort of have a bit of a moan. And that way, when you get to sort of the key part of the engagement, which more often than not, when dealing with strategies, is actually looking at sort of the vision and the policies that you've got, they're a lot more sort of engaged and focused, ready to sort of have a positive say and contribute without sort of having that moan that they might have done if you hadn't done the early stage of engagement. Whilst more and more stakeholders are comfortable to engage in their own time, in person is still key. And we like to sort of get around as many places as possible to ensure that no one has to travel too far. So yeah, in summary, our engagement approach has been refined over time, and we now feel that we sort of constantly exceed expectations set by our clients, and more often than not, we find that our clients start adapting to our approach to engagement and looking at that as best practice. So if anyone wants to find out more on stakeholder engagement, then please do reach out to me, and I'll be happy to sort of talk to you in a bit more detail on that. So in summary, parking strategies provide an ideal opportunity to integrate and promote active and sustainable transport, and it can reduce car park demand. It can encourage modal shift by prioritising alternative transport options, and it can create and promote sustainable communities that improves the quality of life for everyone. The integrated approach will almost certainly lead to better results compared to sort of looking at this in isolation. But it's important that every strategy is looked at sort of individually and bespoke to the local environment. The last point that I'd make is just to stress that parking itself shouldn't be lost in the integration, as many of us rely on parking, and it could have catastrophic consequences if we weren't sort of giving it the due care and attention when sort of considering sort of strategies and planning. Thanks for listening. I hope this has been of some use, and if anyone wants to talk about anything in a little bit more detail or just is after some advice, then please don't hesitate to reach out to me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I've just been told that some people are struggling to hear me, so I've put these on and I look like I'm going to sell you some double glazing. So I apologise if you couldn't hear me before. What's sort of becoming really clear to me, and I think we probably all knew it, was this sort of engagement of residents, etc., to make sure that people understand what's going on, and we manage the competing priorities for the curbside. So yeah, that's becoming a real sort of clear issue that's coming across in most of the presentations this morning. We're now going to move on to Nicola Lodge from IT Associates at ITP. There are still lots of questions coming in, so please put them in there. And I said some people are still putting them in the chat. If you could just use the Q&A box, I'd be very grateful. Nicola, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. And yeah, I think I'm firmly going to try and stick to 10 minutes, given where we are, so you've got enough time for questions. So I guess my presentation will kind of wrap up lots of things we've been talking about. So some of the research around parking and car ownership that Pete touched on, and then bringing it all together into a project that ITP worked on, developing new parking guidance for Essex County Council and Essex Planning Officers Association. So that was really thinking about parking in the context of new development, and particularly large scale development in garden communities. So I'm going to do a whistle stop tour through my first set of slides so that we can really focus on the guidance bit at the end. But firstly, a bit of context for how that project came about, I suppose. We did quite a bit of research building up to developing the parking guidance and parking standards for Essex. And the first question really was, why is parking so important in new development? So it's a constantly evolving issue. As we know, parking, as you've heard today, there's lots of things you can do with parking. It's a moving feast. Curbside parking, footway parking is very contentious, as the next slide suggests. People get very upset about it. Parking near to schools, outside people's houses. We know that parking can upset a lot of people for a variety of reasons. Also, we can't keep doing more of the same. So cars, however they're fueled, petrol, internal combustion, or electric vehicles, ultimately they are clutter on the street scene. Parking relates to car use, and that's causing clutter on our streets. It takes up valuable space that could be used for other modes of travel, could be used for green space, etc. And as I say, it does relate to car use, although not linearly. This is a bit of a fangirl moment because these are some screenshots from Pete's book, as well as another book. And I suppose it's essentially saying that how we design parking into new development and where that parking is has a relationship to then whether people choose to use those cars to make trips. There's the idea of it being the more convenient it is, perhaps more people use it, and also the car being the more dependable mode means that people might want to use their cars more compared to other modes of transport, and I'll touch on that a bit more later. Also, as we know, parking and kind of car storage is wasteful. Cars are dormant and stationary for the majority of their lives, not to personify them. And even kind of when cars are moving or when people are using their cars, they're not actually moving all of the time. Obviously, they get stuck in traffic. So the storage of vehicles is a wasteful use of space, and perhaps there's other ways that we could use space better. But finally, this is also kind of exciting stuff. So I spent a lot of time over the past few years thinking about parking, researching parking, developing these standards for Essex, and therefore I think it's quite an exciting topic to be talking about, but not everyone agrees. But when we rethink how we're using space on our streets and on our highways, then there's some exciting kind of prospects that can come out of that. Reusing space for other modes of travel, for storing other modes, and for entirely different things. Again, we've talked about parklets today, play spaces, play streets, that sort of thing. So I'll dwell a bit more on these slides now. Parking is also complicated, though. We've definitely learned that through all the research that we did. So car ownership is ever changing, not just in terms of the type of vehicle that people are using, so moving from internal combustion to electric, but also we've got an increase in the elderly population, and how they use their cars is different to how working people might use their cars. Younger drivers are actually using their cars less, or even owning cars less than what older generations, not to name them, millennials and older, are using. The cost of living crisis and COVID had an impact on how people were driving or whether they chose to own cars. So there's lots of factors that are coming into play here. And actually, what we learned as well was that we can certainly get carried away with thinking that everybody behaves in the same way that we do. Everyone uses their cars in the same way that we do, and everybody has the same aspirations as we do. That's really not the case. And so looking outside of our industry and the professionals within it was quite a useful way to think about parking and car ownership. And it's also multifaceted. So as we've heard today, simply kind of driving down parking standards or driving down space for parking isn't necessarily going to have good outcomes or be a good thing. We might accept that people want to own their vehicles still, but maybe we would like to encourage them to just use those vehicles less. Also, if we take away all space from the public highway for the storage of sort of vehicles, then maybe we've not got enough space for people to store their bikes or their e-bikes or other modes of travel. And there's relationships between, where parking is and where amenities are and what's most convenient for people to use. As I've said, there's that kind of convenience gap referenced in Pete's book. So there's lots of different ways that we need to think about parking in order to deliver the best outcomes for new developments. And all of that was the precursor to developing this piece of parking guidance for Essex. So just a very brief bit of context about the situation in Essex kind of at the moment, or for the past few years. Essex has, as with everywhere, it's seen a rise in population, and it's also seen a rise in vehicle registrations, basically vehicle ownership. But you can see that the two are not completely linearly related. So over time, vehicle ownership has gone up in Essex at a higher rate than what the population has. On the other side, there's also some interesting kind of key stats. So like I was saying earlier, we might assume that across the country, but particularly in Essex, where I think there's a bit of a stereotype around some of the people that live there and how affluent they are, actually still the biggest majority of households are just single car households, and 40% of households own more than one vehicle. That's also shown in this breakdown of the different districts and boroughs in Essex. whilst you do have some of the more rural and also some of the more affluent areas owning more vehicles per household, some of the areas that are kind of more central or perhaps better connected or have other factors coming into play, they own very few vehicles per household. And this led us to think that a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to parking stands in Essex wasn't going to be right. We needed something that was flexible and that could sort of mould towards the context of a place, the context of a new development, both how it is at the moment, but also what it might be providing in terms of infrastructure as it's built out. And this is just another bit of context to say that Essex is, I think, across the country, perhaps delivering the most garden communities and large-scale developments in new towns as an authority. So we had parking standards to think about for kind of any new development in Essex, but also that specific focus on how could these really large-scale developments do things differently and provide parking in a way which kind of suits the needs of the people that are going to live there and can achieve sustainable mobility outcomes as well. So the first thing we did, upsettingly, kind of just before the DfT published their connectivity mapping, was we developed our own connectivity mapping for Essex. It kind of brought in a range of factors, so walking accessibility, cycling accessibility, and also public transport accessibility, and then defined the areas of Essex which were more or less connected. And it kind of gives the obvious results that in the cities and the centres of cities, you have the best connected places, whereas the more rural areas are generally the least connected and least accessible by sustainable modes. And then we use that connectivity mapping as part of a toolkit to basically rethink parking demand and future parking demand in new developments. And we looked at it firstly as a function of the existing situation. So we mapped out existing car ownership across the county, existing trip making, or essentially existing mode share, and also existing connectivity from that mapping. And we then thought about what could the future situation be through new development. And that's a little bit different already. So instead of looking at a town and saying this has got a parking problem, this has got a traffic problem, we expect a new development on the edge of it to deliver the same outcomes. We said, well, if you bring in that vision-led approach, what would we like to do differently and how would we achieve that? And that's trying to bring into the idea of deriving parking standards the fact that if you locate that new development near to local amenities or put local amenities into it, then people might want to walk more. Equally, if you deliver new sustainable travel infrastructure as part of that development, then people might use it more. And also, how can you design the parking in so that it's perhaps less attractive or perhaps uses land more efficiently? And the next couple of slides could be at risk of kind of being death by spreadsheets. So this is just an overview, but we developed a scoring matrix that you could apply as a developer or a planning officer or a transport consultant to a new development, which takes into account the existing context of the development and also, like I said, those kind of future scenarios and situations. And you score your development against the framework and ultimately come up with a final score. And that then defines the parking budget, as we called it. So a level of parking that you'd expect to see at that new development, taking into account its potential to do better than the sort of status quo or the baseline parking standards that you'd apply to somewhere which is very unsustainable or not very well connected. And in doing that, we also defined sort of minimum scoring thresholds that these large scale developments and garden communities would need to achieve in terms of their connectivity and their proposals. And if a site is not achieving those scores, then actually it's a case of the developer going back to the drawing board because it's just not acceptable to be delivering development where expecting car ownership to be higher. So it's a bit of an iterative process. And the end result is, as I say, a parking budget. And there's flexibility within it. As I say, not one size fits all, but it allows for a developer and their consultant to have a budget to work within and then decide how they deliver that on street. To some extent, how much of that is on plot, which is not very space efficient, versus how much of it is off plot, which is more space efficient. And it still has the allowance for visitor parking, car club spaces, and there's the availability within the tool as well to look at how many spaces you might be saving compared to a more predict and provide approach, so that people can really see the impacts of delivering less parking and spending their money on more sustainable transport infrastructure. And in the guidance, this is supported by design principles. So lots of the things I've been saying, it's more efficient to have shared parking and off-plot parking. all of the parking, wherever it is, needs to be thinking about place kind of at the forefront. So not just sticking cars in front of houses, but how can this be screened, better integrated into kind of greening of the street scene. At the same time, make sure that parking is accessible to all. So where people have that for their disabled people's bays, are they in the right places? And then other obvious things, needs to be secure, needs to feel safe. Need to consider parking management and restrictions from the outset rather than retrospectively, and it also needs to be future proof, particularly for things like electric vehicle charging. And then my final slide really is that all of this can work. So whilst the guidance we produced is relatively novel in terms of what other authorities across the country have done thus far, we can already see places that have achieved really good things through their parking strategies. Obviously, you won't be able to read all these, but as part of the guidance, we kind of inserted into that at various points different case studies of places in the UK and in Europe that have achieved really good outcomes, in part due to their parking strategies. And I guess what I'd say here is we can get carried away thinking that, you know, our semi-rural development somewhere in the East Midlands could never achieve the same as what somewhere in London could. But when you think about the key ingredients that there are in London to achieve a sustainable place, you could think about how could those be imitated elsewhere in the country. So London has a really good density of public transport hubs, a really good density of amenities, facilities, you know, places that people want to go day to day. Those are the things that make it a sustainable place and that mean that people want to rent their car less. So how can we deliver that sort of thing at developments elsewhere in Essex or nationally? And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Gavin, we can't hear you.
No. Can you hear me at all now, Mark?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, sorry about that. My laptop decided to do an update during that. If I can now perhaps wake the others up, wake Adam, Pete and Gossica again. If you could turn your cameras on. Just prior to that, I'm sorry, I'm going to do another quick shameless plug for the Decarbonising Transport Awards. For those that joined late, if entries can be in by Friday the 5th of December, and then there's a great awards lunch on the 27th. I'm sure Gossica can attest to what a good show Landor LINKS put on as an award winner herself. So I apologise, that will be the last you hear from me about the decarbonisation transport, at least today anyway. We've got lots of questions coming in, and I will try and get through as many as I can, but we have got quite a few, so I apologise if I don't get to you. Let's start with perhaps one for Pete to start with. The easier availability of parking. Can you please summarise what impact this has on demand driver behaviour? So I guess if there are lots of parking spaces, how do we stop people driving if we're providing the spaces for them to do it? If you build it, they will come, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not going to have a quick answer to that one. Sorry for being unhelpful to pick it apart, but we can talk about easier being to a few components of ease and like perceived availability of whether there will be a parking spot. So
I guess so, yeah.
Some people defer their trips because they perceive that it will be a nightmare to park. I mean, I'm getting quite colloquial now, but they'll perceive there won't be a space, so they might defer some of their travel behaviour as a result. Ease of parking is also the finding of the space and the hassle and the friction there, the pain of paying, as the psychological phrase goes. So how easy it is to physically pay, and also how salient those sort of costs are. Ease of parking might also clearly be the location of the parking, of whether it's in a convenient place. So whether someone finds parking easy when it's, say, a park and ride, so then have to switch, then switching modes, but then they gain some flexibility of being able to go out wherever they want in the city and then returning whenever they like. I think I might defer the question because I don't think it's one that can answer broadly, but I think Nicola had done some research, if I'm right, Nicola, the work you did in Essex about car parking availability and inducing demand.
Yeah, that's right. We looked at it, and there is that kind of, there's a positive relationship, as I said, but it's not very linear. So parking in itself, all by itself, if you focused on that, does not really directly relate to an increase in car use. But when you think about where the parking is and how much there is of it, and whether people also have the choice to get on their bike because that's stored on their front garden, or walk 5 minutes down the road to the shop, all of those sort of ingredients put together, like thinking about it holistically, parking is one of, say, 6 things that ultimately lead towards more or less car use and trip making. And yeah, we had a kind of a body of research that went into our evidence-based report that really backs that up. So it was, not really speculation, but kind of factually, you can see that there is that relationship.
Okay, thank you. And sort of there's quite a few questions coming in, but one that's I'll try and summarise them, from Councillor Rob Breyer from Bristol City Council. And this probably, Gossica, may be something that you and Adam could help with. Have you reduced parking bays, and if so, what's been the result? So has there been any progressive reduction in on-street parking over the years in Hackney? And how would you advise another local authority to do that, bearing in mind we have residents who want to park their cars?
I think, thank you for that question. I think from our perspective, we have reduced the number of bays. We needed to do that when you're putting a cycle hanger in, when you're putting other sustainable modes of transportation in. That is a general reduction in parking bays. In Hackney, we do not guarantee a parking space. So even though you do have a parking permit, it doesn't guarantee you a parking space. And I guess with what we outlined as our journey, and residents and businesses and people that come to Hackney in terms of what they need to do, that journey was the choice of, do you need to drive? So some people changed their vehicles, some people came out of their vehicles, some people went into cycles. We can't directly say that's what they did, because all we can say is that we know that from our perspective, there were less diesel vehicles on the road. There's a slight increase in terms of electric vehicles on the road. And I would say for other local authorities, every local authority or district or borough district is going to be different. And it's just looking at your information, go to the detail, go to the data, and look at where people are at the moment when it comes to their driving habits, and make that be how you make that decision. That's what I would say.
Yeah, Adam, any comments?
I mean, what Gossica said is absolutely spot on. I think places like Hackney, Camden, Waltham Forest, I think have sort of seen quite a lot of reduction in spaces. And the easiest way to do that is by providing either more options to travel alternatively, or improve the environment to make it more attractive to use those other facilities. So with the livable neighbourhoods, the healthy streets, introducing sort of programs like that, introducing schemes where it's more attractive to walk, will naturally sort of encourage people to do so. A lot of the evidence we've found, safety is a key factor in people's willingness to do that. So it certainly needs to be done sort of as an integrated approach, not looking at it in isolation. I think if you try to do it in isolation, the resistance will be strong. And I'd also say, I think it might have been Westminster that sort of they came up with sort of quite an innovative approach to sort of trying to get in their cycle parking bays, and they got members to sort of almost sign up to this is what we are going to do, regardless of sort of the level of opposition we're going to experience. So as a result, when that sort of opposition came, when that objection came, sort of as part of the TRO or TMO process, members were sort of going into bat for officers, which gave officers a stronger platform to be able to then sort of defend the position, and to sort of say, well, this is the approach that we want to make. So I think if you can do it as collectively as you possibly can, I think that will help sort of reduce the opposition.
Which kind of comes on to a question from Ian Baker, who describes himself as between jobs, but I'm sure that doesn't define you, Ian. How to free up space for active travel, should EVs and cycle bays be in hubs and car parks and not on the highway? I guess perhaps Ian's asking, we're asking people, we're removing more bays that people want to park on. So there's a lot coming through for certainly for Adam and Gossica, I'm afraid, but we'll definitely try and spread them out. What do you guys think about that? Where should these EV bays be?
Well, I would sort of, the principle of it, you would suggest that if you can create sort of the EV charging hubs that are starting to pop up more and more places, then you can have more facilities together, and there's benefits in that from a sort of a power supply and other sort of environmental improvements. What can't be lost, though, is the fact that people need to feel safe. If they are residents, then they potentially want to be charged overnight. So they're not going to potentially be willing to leave their vehicles on charge in a hub and then have to feel about sort of safety getting back to their property. So whilst that is the ultimate sort of model that you could aspire to, it needs to sort of take on board that if you haven't got off-street parking, then you still need to have those facilities available. And there's ways to do that which can sort of try to encourage people to maybe use it sort of at night when there's going to be less people that would be using sort of the curbside and using sort of facilities. So you could try to integrate it, but I wouldn't lose the sort of the safety aspect in that.
Thank you. Gossica, any feelings from Hackney? Where are your EV bays at the moment? Are they on the street?
I think for Hackney, in terms of car parks and things like that, we don't have very many in car parks. Like, don't have many spaces in car parks, or many car parks in that respect. So most of our EVs are on street in locations where people can reach them and use them. It makes it more accessible to those who want to make that change if they can see where they can then charge their car. As I explained in my presentation, a lot of the makeup of Hackney is very dense. So having them on street at the end of your road, you can see we've got different types of EV charging points as well, which makes it even more attractive in that respect. So I think you've got to speak to where the demand is. I think you've got to speak to what the makeup is of your borough. If you've got lots of car parks, then maybe yes, put it in those locations, but I wouldn't at all just use that as the only place. It's got to be where it's needed.
Thank you. There's an interesting comment come from Paul Rogers on the chat that said, why should local authorities provide EV charging points? They don't supply petrol. Let's not get into that, but interesting comment. Just a quick one from Paul Robinson from Cam Cycle. The role of technology in improving enforcement of parking restrictions. How do you see that going, Gossica? It's directed at you, I'm afraid. You're still on mute.
Sorry, would you repeat the question for me? Sorry.
What role can technology play in improving enforcement of parking restrictions and potentially reducing the cost to do so?
Yeah, I think technology in terms of parking restrictions, it's automated, like ANPR in that respect. It's having the most up-to-date technology in terms of that respect. I think when you're looking at restrictions, if we're talking about parking zones and things like that, or we're talking about the actual enforcement?
I think the actual enforcement I would read into that.
Yeah, if it's enforcement, then things like ANCPR, having the most up-to-date technology, but also having the policy to support it, the training of the people that are going out to ensure that they understand the policy and how to enforce to make sure that it is up to date and good. So that would be what I would say in that respect.
Okay, thank you. We're getting a number of questions about rural locations, so I'm going to just try and summarize them. A lot of people are asking, I think this is probably for Nicola and Pete and Adam, maybe give you a bit of a breather, Gossica. Rural locations have limited bus services. Unless you're incredibly fit, you can't cycle the 30 miles to the nearest town. I live in a very rural location, and I worked out one day that if I got a bus to my nearest town, by the time I'd got there, the bus coming back had already left. So this clearly restricts people's movements. How do we see that changing, or do we see anything that can help rural communities at all?
I could start.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
yeah, I
Nicola.
think similar sort of question coming from Michael as well, who's updating Oxfordshire's parking standards. Certainly, what we found with Essex, or what we kind of proposed in Essex, was that, like I said, it's not one size fits all, and we kind of can't solve all of the transport problems of a place just by the parking policy that applies to them. So we do have to accept that in more rural areas, until people have alternative choices and they need to have spaces to park their cars, and really we ought to be providing that space so that we don't have all of the unintended consequences of parking overspill and that sort of thing. So in that parking guidance, there's flexibility around, well, if you're in this sort of location, then maybe you can have more parking spaces. And if you're in this sort of location, you should really ought to have less. And then there's an onus on the developer to try and at least improve the situation wherever they are. And then I think really, how do we solve it? It's, like I say, treating parking as one element of a holistic transport strategy that applies to a place. So parking is almost the outcome of a variety of factors that mean that people can't travel more sustainably. Like you say, Gavin, if it takes that long to get the bus, then why would you use it? So it goes back to what is the transport strategy for a place, and how are these kind of, maybe the devolved governments now, how are they dealing with that strategic plan for a whole area, including the rural areas as well as the urban ones?
Thank you. Pete, does this fit in your remit at all, or is it?
Less so, if I can answer the
Less,
previous question.
Of course.
My interest was piqued about parking enforcement. I attended a conference by My Permit, who are big, most all know the name. It could be really interesting developments, I think, with technology of ability to enforce. They demonstrated, and I stress demonstrated, a body-worn camera that would do a ANPR as the parking warden moved around, and possible that that person could even be on a bike or on a cycle. So the amount of cover that a parking warden could move through, as opposed to the manual checking of when a vehicle arrived and left, that level of automation could be quite dramatic for street parking, I think. And the reason that interests me is the perception of enforcement is a really important aspect for conditioning someone's behaviour. So if they think that it's likely there will be enforcement, then they'll change the way they act. And I don't think it's a controversial thing to say that it's not a good situation that people are paying fines. They don't want to be fined, and also we would prefer that the fine changes behaviour rather than just raises revenue.
Thank you. We also a number of, so I can sort of probably answer that for you a little bit. That technology has been available quite a long time. It's actually down to the traffic regulation orders and the viewing time and when they arrived and when they were first seen. And it's not as easy as it should be, to be quite honest with you, Pete. We're getting a number of questions about electric vehicles and their size and weight. And somebody described them as being just as dangerous as a diesel vehicle if they hit a pedestrian or cycle. Thank you, Beth. I think Gossica is probably again back to you. Was there any consideration about charging by size of vehicle in Hackney or anywhere else in London that you're aware of?
Yeah, so when it comes to the size of the vehicle, in terms of our parking policy and the parking enforcement plan that we did in 2021 and went live in 2022 for the period of 5 years up until 27 now, we considered where we were at that point. So it was about the diesel element, it was about the petrol element, it was about trying to ensure that we do have those alternative modes of transportation and working in conjunction with our street scene counterparts. I think now the story has moved along, and I think for the next parking enforcement plan, we'll be looking at how we can think about the size, the weight, the length of the vehicle, think about the different classes within electric vehicle charging to look at it. But at the time, our focus was mainly on that. I think it's Haringey have done something along length, size and weight at the moment, and they're leading the way with that. So I think that's the area that is most interesting. And there was something I attended as well with Clean Cities recently, where they did a whole seminar on the weight, height and length and how we can do that and enforce that within local authorities and across the UK. So it's something that's piqued my interest. It's something that we will be looking at for the next parking enforcement plan. But the one that we just did, it just wasn't feasible because that's not where we were.
Cool. Great. Some 3 really quick wins. How are emission-based parking enforced in Hackney?
Emissions-based charging is enforced through the parking permit price. So we go to the DVLA, we find out what their emission is, and it comes into a 13 band, and that's how it's enforced.
Okay. This a personalised disabled base, something I haven't come across. Does that mean other people can't use them? Other people with disabilities?
It reserves a space in front of someone that's got a severe disability outside their house, and nobody else can use it.
And a final quick win. Cycle hangers, thefts from cycle hangers, is that a big thing? I guess that, Adam, you might have comments on that too.
In cycle hangers, there have been some instances where people, it has happened, but it's very, very minor. It's not a lot. And what we always do, we've got service level agreements in place to ensure that the cycle hangers back up and running for the other people that are in that shelter. But we do encourage people to lock their bikes in the cycle hanger and use locks that are safe to do that and secure.
Thank you. Perhaps one for everybody. Does private parking provisions in local areas affect the charging for spaces? So if you have got large NCPs, or sorry, large car parks, should I say, around, how does that affect the policies and the strategies that you come out with? And I know, Gossica, you said you don't have many car parks, so maybe Nicola, that's something you might have come across in Essex. Are they taken into consideration at all?
Yeah, to be fair, it probably isn't, because the parking standards are applicable to new development, new growth, where generally, and on larger scale growth, where generally you're thinking about a new settlement as a place. So yeah, you might think about what the parking standards need to be for the non-residential elements of that place, and that could be large scale communal parking. But we generally weren't needing to think about the context of public and payable car parks when developing.
Nicola, one for you, and I'm just rushing through this a bit like the end of the University Challenge. Young drivers are using their car less. Does that apply to all settings? Is that applying to urban, rural? Do you have any more data on that?
Yeah, I couldn't quote the actual numbers to you, but yeah, it is a national trend applying to both the urban and rural context. But like I say, there's other things that have played into it. So whether you're in an urban area or a rural area, the cost of owning and running a car sort of is still a disbenefit. So people are generally owning them less, and younger people are more willing to use public transport to get around.
Perhaps one for Adam and maybe Pete. Should housing developments be refused if there is no alternative car space or car to use?
It needs to be protected. It's critical that as part of the planning process, the right surveys are being done, because what you don't want, people aren't going to give up their cars, they're just going to park somewhere else. It might encourage them to use their cars less, and it might reduce it by some, but there's still going to be that parking demand. So if you provide no parking, then you risk just displacing vehicles onto nearby surrounding roads, which may or may not be geared up for that. So if you've got parking pressures already around developments, and I think it's important to strike a balance with try not to have too many parking spaces to encourage active travel and sustainable travel, but not just to sort of remove it completely.
Yeah. And if I might come in on the vehicle size one, I think it's there's a policy razor to be used here, which is don't do things you won't regret in the future, and not regulating on vehicle size is surely something that we regret now, because it's someone's choice to get a much larger vehicle, and the costs are imposed on so many other people. What would need to happen, as we heard, for why it would be difficult, is to have a national register that where the DVLA collects size of vehicle and other factors that then can be looked up and then done for car parking charging. So even if vehicle excise duty, the annual tax, isn't reformed at the moment, it's only done on carbon emissions per kilometre. It should be done on another database so that other people can refer to and use it. But I think vehicle size is a real no-brainer for a personal choice that has big societal consequences.
I completely agree. It's one of the reasons my big car's off the road. I met a chap from Bristol, you probably know, I can't remember his name, from the car alliance, large car alliance, who persuaded me that my car was dangerous, and I think he's absolutely right. I've got one final question that perhaps I'll just open to all of you, and it's amused me since it came in. We try and stay away from political as much as we can, but Councillor Rob Breyer has asked, what are the prospects for the UK government announcing road user charging in this Parliament? I personally think they've probably got other things to worry about, but I would, I'm interested in it. It amused me, that question, is perhaps a final one for Pete, perhaps if you might want to answer first.
What are the prospects? Very low, because they could have put it on a manifesto, and then you see the Secretary of State's description of the Transport Select Committee that's not being considered. Yeah, I don't think it's being considered. It will become a learning platform as EVs gain adoption, and there might be some other ones, but in the next Parliament, I think unlikely. Now, will there be stuff done in the background? Will there be thinking? Will there be international reviews of what other countries are doing? For sure. Like, there can still be monitoring and there still can be policy development, but whether or not it goes all the way up to a proposal, I think unlikely.
I suspect, Gossica, you're not allowed to answer this, being a government, a local authority officer. So I'll pass on you. Adam, do you any views very quickly? We've probably got about 30 seconds.
I mean, I agree. I don't think it's certainly imminent. You only have to look at sort of the constant political issue that comes with charging people to park in hospitals to see how much sort of opposition and resistance that demonstrates. If you sort of were to bring it out wider, I think it would be incredibly challenging. I think sort of the workplace parking levies like Nottingham, I think, could be an area that you could target a lot more before you start thinking about just general sort of road charging.
Nicola, any views on this?
Yeah, again, low prospects. I mean, I think we all lost the plot with the previous government. Was it the plan for drivers, plan for cars? I think that kind of set our stall out for many more years to come. But I don't think we need to rule out kind of regional, devolved, local government level of sort of road user charging tariffs, workplace parking levies, that sort of thing.
Excellent. Listen, I'm being beeped at, which means I've got to wrap this up. But I would really like to take the opportunity to thank you, Pete, Adam, Gossica, and Lucy, for joining us. I'm sorry I couldn't get through all the questions. We will obviously share this webinar out if anyone wants it. And I've seen there's a lot of things in the chat. I will just end this by answering John Elliott's final question. I've known John for 38 years, and he's suggested rather than driving my big car and live in the country, I should move to a city. Thank you, John. I will consider that. Again, thank you all for your time. Thank you everyone who's joined. I look forward to seeing you all again.